What up? Reverend Brian Akers here, and this is It's Really Real, Racial Equity. So before I get started, I really want to make it clear that when it comes to the issue of racial equity, the only perspective I can truly speak from is the perspective of a white, male, cis-gendered member of our community. And that's important because for too long, this conversation of racial equity has really landed in the laps of members of the global majority, Black folks and other people of color who are tasked with having to do the work of bringing their own issues and their own equitable outcomes forward and demanding justice in those areas. But as a young man who was raised by a severely mentally ill single parent, a father, I have to admit that for the earlier portions of my life, I was basically raised by society, the society in which I lived. My environment became my family and my parents and my primary source of information. And so everything that I picked up in my youth was really coming heavily and deeply from social messaging. And so when I look through the lens of racial equity, what I begin to see is what kinds of messaging I was being given and afforded that were either privileges or concepts that really embedded racial and raciality, racial issues and raciality into my subconscious. And so, we can't put ourselves on the hook for what it was that we learned when we were young. We should have learned better. We should have known better. We should have had better influences. We should have this. We should have that. But when I look at this concept of racial equity, for me, I can only see it as a white man. I was always raised to be non-racist. My father was, part of the hippie movement. He was really adamant about, the equality of people. And so I was really given this gift of like a little bit of a head start, which was that my father was really vehemently about equality. And so I just love and appreciate that even in his condition, that was something that he valued so much, that he really instilled that in me. But over time, I began to learn that equality didn't actually equal justice. And I have to admit, the turning point for me was when I moved from California with my young family all the way out to the East Coast to live in Maryland. And I live in Columbia, Maryland, which is a little suburb just outside of Baltimore City. And the town that I moved into, this Columbia town, it was actually back in the civil rights era, was built by a developer who was really committed to creating justice through racial access. And what that meant for him was he went around, and his name was James Rouse, and he went around and he bought up all of these parcels of land that were all connected to one another. And when he had enough land put together, he incorporated all of it under one thing and began building a town that was a kind of a social experiment, if you will. And as a visionary, what he saw was a place where the settlements were built into the lands to preserve the natural landscape so that we didn't destroy that as we were developing into it. And another was that people should be able to live and work and play all in the same town. And so there's a lot of pathways and stuff that allow people to get around via bikes or walking or whatever the case might be. But the last one was the most important. And in his own words, what he said was, if you need to know the color of your neighbor's skin before you purchase a home, don't come here. And that was an extremely radical thing for a white man to be saying back in that era. And when he started to create it, he gathered a bunch of really great experts, professors, business leaders, and what's the word I'm looking for? What's that major that everybody takes in college but then can never use?
What is the most astounding fact you can share with us about the universe? The most astounding fact is the knowledge.
Oh yeah, that's right. Anthropologists, social engineers. And so he got this team together. But one thing you should know about this team is that it was mostly male and all white. And he created what he thought would be a really great equitable thing. And I honor him for that. He did an amazing thing in his era, and I am honored to live in his town. But when I moved here, I kind of thought that that would mean that it would be a really welcoming landscape for radicals who wanted to continue to push that vision into even greater clarity and greater awareness and greater activity. And so I landed here back in 2014. Was it 14? And in 2015, Baltimore experienced an uprising in response to the death and murder of Freddie Gray. And I remember that time being the time when I thought I knew what being radical was, and then I had come to an awareness that I had no idea. And that's when I was really radicalized. And so since that time, I've started looking into what does it mean to be working in society and in culture to shift things in order to create more justice and more equity for folks who've been denied those things for so long. And so as I did that as a spiritual leader, I began to realize that this was a really powerful spiritual experience, because what it meant was, as a white man, going in and untying a lot of those knots that had been put in there in my mind when I was younger. Things that I didn't even realize were happening. The fact that all of my media exposure had been coming through majorly white contexts. And so over time, that evolved into a place where I thought that I was a great non-racist. I really loved Black culture. I really loved Black music. I really spent a lot of time defending being against people who were explicitly racist. But it wasn't until Freddie Gray's death that I realized that there was some larger thing working here than just the simple narrative I had been taught as a child. This idea that, you know, racism was about Ku Klux Klan and bed sheets and burning crosses and Nazi swastikas and, you know, American History X, which was a movie that actually really impacted me very heavily in my younger days. But what I began to realize was that racism was far more insidious, and that the injustices that had been committed in the contexts of race were even more unspeakable and disgusting than I had ever realized. And so fast forward, as I'm leaning in and I'm going out, what I found myself doing was trying to ask people of the global majority, Black folks and other people of color, you know, hey, help me, educate me, tell me what's up, let me know what's going on. And what I realized over time was that I was asking them to explain their lived experience to me so that I could be a better human being when it came to how I treated and how I engaged with systems and institutions and cultures and society to provide more justice and more equity. I really began to realize that I wasn't gaining the trust of people of color. I wasn't being invited into Black folks' experiences in ways that was really vulnerable and authentic. And I believe that the reason that that happened to me was because I was a white man who was so headstrong about wanting to do the work that I thought I could go in and fix everything, which is a very white thing to do. But for me, I realized that deep connections and intimate relationships with people of color wasn't really necessarily a thing that could start by me going and reaching out to that community and trying to embed myself in that community. Yeah, that's also very white. It actually started with me doing some reading and some studying and some self-development, some cultivation of my own awarenesses, my own understandings, and my own perception around concepts of race, systems, institutions, and the way that injustices perpetuate themselves and then embed themselves into our culture in ways that we don't even realize that we're contributing to those perpetrations and perpetuations. And so the more I read and the more I studied and the more I began to open up to what was really my work to do, the more access, the more welcoming, and the more just the more love that I began to be shown by Black folks and people of color. And so as I continue on this journey, because racial equity isn't a thing that you just learn and then you get it. Like racial equity is so deeply racial inequity is so deeply ingrained in our social and societal constructs and cultural habits and systemic practices that I don't think I'll ever fully grasp or understand all of it. It's just not a thing that I'll ever stop getting better at unwinding. And so my work, what's mine to do is to really, in my opinion, to talk to white folks about racism and racial equity from that perspective, to create opportunities for white folks to start grappling with and dealing with ways that we benefit from, that we contribute to, that we perpetuate, and that we are taught to be ignorant of in our society around racialized topics. And I haven't found anything yet that our society hasn't found some way to racialize. And so this is my invitation to you, not to tell you that like I've got it all figured out and I'm going to tell you how to do it. Oh, there's another white thing. Yep, that's another very white thing. This is my invitation to say like, look, we've got work to do. White folks have a lot of work to do. And if we're going to do that work, we've got to start talking about it. We've got to start listening. And you know, there's this, listen and learn thing. And listening and learning is vital and important to the process, but also being together and holding each other accountable as white people, and stepping into that willingness to not just listen and learn, but to be vulnerable, to transform our own styles of thinking, and to challenge everything that we've believed. Because when they planted this seed in us, it was planted there with a bunch of natural defense systems that most white folks experience and don't even realize. When someone brings up race, or when you're in a racially charged conversation or context, and you get that like heightened fight or flight sense of like response to it, that's a fear-based response that has been put there, sometimes very deliberately and consciously, and other times very unwittingly and naively. But ultimately, it's ours. If it's in us, it is ours to do. It is ours to address. It is ours to work on. And it is irresponsible for people who are part of an oppressive system to place the burden of liberation on those who are being oppressed. And so this spiritual journey became relevant to me because what I realized was that too often people talk about the injustices and the inequities that Black people and people of color experience. And not enough white folks are talking about why those things are harming white folks as well. And why, as a spiritual human being that really believes in the goodness and the wholeness and the perfection of humanity, someone who really believes that we are here by divine creation, that it is our responsibility to liberate ourselves so that we can become instruments of liberation for those who've never had enough power or authority to generate that kind of liberation for themselves. And so this is my invitation. This particular stream of my media will be entirely dedicated to learning more about, understanding more about, expressing more about, and being willing to publicly, openly, adamantly speak about what it means not just to be non-racist by really thinking that racism is bad, but becoming anti-racist by doing the internalized work of identifying and addressing those things within me that are operating, that I have not challenged, that I gain benefits from, that part of me wants to defend and not surrender and is afraid of losing and missing out on. That opportunity for me to begin the process of healing and for me to do it publicly. And you guys don't have to do it publicly, but I invite you to do it willingly and authentically and rigorously. I'm not here to play around about this topic. I'm here to get as deep into it as I possibly can, learn as much as I can, and do as much good as possible. And so for me, racial equity is the greatest call of my ministry outside of simply the pastoral ministry itself. Outside of promoting spiritual wellness and spiritual practice and spiritual community, the highest priority in my ministry is to begin to address my own understandings and awarenesses around race and racialized topics, which is pretty much every one of them, and to move into the work of being an advocate, a light, a willing participant, and sometimes, you know what, a sacrificial lamb to learn and to grow and to bring something greater into being than the status quo. And so if you're interested in being a white person who's doing that work, or you're a person of color that is willing to lend your perspectives and insights or your accountability, I invite you to be a part of this work. And I welcome it. And I pray that the work that we do is blessed, is graceful, and leads us to a place where we have been ushered out of our ignorance and into an understanding that really unlocks the potential that we have to become allies and advocates for those who are vulnerable to these systemic and cultural and explicit expressions of such a painful and such a hideous curse on the American soul. The illness, the sickness, the curse of racism. So let's do it. I'm ready. I think you are too. Let's go. Peace. What up? Reverend Brian here again, and this is the end of the video where I ask you, if you like this content, like and share it. And if you subscribe to it, that would be amazing. And most importantly, if you want to be notified every time I upload a new video, just click that bell and YouTube will make sure that you never miss a single one. Thank you so much for supporting my work. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. And I'm just knowing that something amazing is unfolding in your life right now. Peace.